Welcome, fellow seeker. If you are watching, something brought you here, and I'm about to show you that it was no accident. You've already gone through some sort of awakening, and you've realized that many things that you were taught have been totally false. This includes the narrative of history. In this presentation, I will demonstrate a brand new framework that takes all the evidence you've known your entire life and explains all of it. From the pyramids to advanced ancient civilizations, from the Dark Ages to our most present energy age, this framework explains it all, using well-known historical facts, archaeology, and modern science. No leaps of faith required. The current worldview based on mainstream views is the one that we're slowly learning is not correct. This mainstream view is that the universe is totally chaotic and entirely material. There is never any reference to spirit or to God. We came from chaos and doom, the Big Bang, and we are headed towards chaos and doom through random evolution and ultimate extinction. Life is an accident, and we therefore are always facing imminent destruction. God is not here to save us, according to this view. Throughout history, there have been random episodes of collapse and descent of civilization. So along with these risks, we also face the ever-encroaching tyranny, which is even put forward by the alternative media today. They're kind of playing the same fear game that the mainstream media is playing. This means that they expect you to follow the way of the ego. It's every man for himself. But that is not the truth. Welcome to the live stream, guys. I gotta say hi to everybody. Welcome, Susan, Ian, Eleanor, and Tim. Great to have you guys. As always, I will be reading all of your comments and answering all of your questions because I'm here for the live viewers primarily. I'm here to interact with you guys, and I want to answer any questions you have or answer any comments that you might have on this presentation or anything about the way of service. Everybody just says hi, so let's continue. So let's get back to history. This is what we've been told about history. There has been a linear progression of history, which is referred to in this book I'm going to reference, from the ancient rags to modern riches story. This posits that today is the absolute pinnacle of human achievement. You can see in the picture, we went from the barbaric hunter-gatherer dressed in rags and struggling for survival every day to the modern man who is the pinnacle of evolution. And there is nothing higher really to look forward to other than the constant march of technology and always facing fears that imminent destruction is looming, that AI is coming to take our job, that the government is encroaching on our freedoms. But what about the anomalies in the historical record? Usually the answer is, we don't know. They just did it somehow. Kind of brings to mind discarded ancient or even just recent past scientific theories that may explain some things, but they're ultimately discarded because there are better theories that fit the evidence. Let's start with the first elephant in the room, the Great Pyramid of Giza. I'm quoting again from the book I will reveal shortly. No single artifact more clearly reveals the presence of advanced knowledge in the ancient past than the Great Pyramid of Giza, And no single ancient artifact turns the linear conception of human development on its head more thoroughly than the Great Pyramid of Giza. That linear conception is the idea that we came from those ancient rags, the hunter-gatherer, the primitive societies, to the modern riches where we are now at the pinnacle of civilization. If we to follow that narrative that the ancient peoples are the ones who built these pyramids, we have to admit that it was an impossible construction. It is still the heaviest structure on Earth. It has perfect alignment to the cardinal directions, that's north, east, west, and south. Its circumference is the ratio of pi, and its height ratio is phi, which is the golden ratio. These are not coincidences. The flatness and straight lines that are found both outside and inside the Great Pyramid are impossible to recreate, even with current modern devices. As in, it would be impossible to build a structure of this size to the specifications that it is built, even with our modern technology. After carefully studying the Great Pyramid with an eye of a professional machinist, the modern craft that is able to produce objects with the highest degree of accuracy and precision known today, Christopher Dunn, author of The Giza Power Plant, concluded, quote, "The bald fact is that the Great Pyramid, by any standard old or new, is the largest and most accurately constructed building in the world." But this is what they tell us, and I will let the narrator of the book read to you now, because he does such a great job.
Mainstream historians and archaeologists maintain that the pyramids were built over the course of 2 or 3 decades by thousands of workers using simple tools. Even if we grant that a primitive culture could figure out how to transport the vast amounts of stone to the building site, we are still left with a mystery of how they cut, dressed, and placed 2.5 million blocks at an average rate of 1 block every 4 minutes for 20 years. Some of these blocks weigh as much as 70 tons and were taken to a height nearly half that of the Empire State Building. Further, if conventional thinking is to be accepted, all this was accomplished using only wood, stone, or copper tools and plaited ropes.
Think about that, okay? 1 block every 4 minutes for 20 years. That's what it would have taken. And we all seen this picture. I was joking with my wife about this picture here. She mentioned it actually. It was her idea to put it in the presentation because we all saw this picture as if it was like, we know it's totally ridiculous to believe this, so we have to show you this cartoon image over and over of the people dragging a giant stone 500 miles to build the Great Pyramids. And then after they built these Great Pyramids, they did nothing else of the sort, right? That's the story that we've been told. But what if the pyramids can be explained by the fact that they were constructed by a far more advanced civilization than the mainstream narrative allows? I think a lot of people, when they look at the pyramids, ask that question. Let me check in. Okay. Glad you can hear me. All right. Susan says it sounds dark. That's right. The mainstream view is dark. And the entire purpose of this presentation is to show you that the truth is the opposite of dark. So stick around to the end because I'm getting there. Let's examine another elephant in the room. The rise and fall of empires. We're taught that it happens randomly throughout history. I mean, everyone's heard of the rise and fall of Rome. But what about simultaneous collapse? In the same 100 years of the collapse of Rome, Persia, India, and Teotihuacan all fell. Also, if you expand that window out just a few more hundred years, 200 or 300 more years, we find that also the Mayan civilization collapsed and the Chinese empire collapsed. You can see on this chart, China collapses in 220 AD, the Roman Empire began to split, and then in 476, Rome was sacked several times, and then within less than 10 years, the Persian Empire was sacked. The Guptas in India fell in 500 AD, only 24 years later. Then 100 years later, Teotihuacan was destroyed. I'm sorry if I'm butchering the pronunciation of that one, but it was one of the great cities of the Americas. And then, I don't know about you, but I remember hearing about the Mayan collapse and how nobody could explain it. The Mayans just collapsed. We don't know why. We have no idea why. I believe that you will be finding out why by the end of this presentation. Every major empire across the planet, basically at the same time, everywhere. Was 500 AD the bottom of history? Even the mainstream accepts 500 AD as the beginning of the, quote, Dark Ages. But they never mention that this Dark Age occurred everywhere. That's because they can't explain it using the random rise and fall of empires framework. Let's look at another unexplainable historical fact. Golden Age myths in every culture. According to MIT professor Giorgio de Santillana in Hamlet's Mill, that book he wrote, more than 30 ancient cultures describe cycles of enlightenment and dark ages linked to astronomical phenomena. We'll see later that another piece of evidence is the megalithic observatories found throughout the world, built before the dawn of civilization. You've probably heard of Stonehenge, but I bet you haven't heard of the even bigger observatory built 7,000 years before Stonehenge. Again, because it doesn't fit the narrative. Back to Golden Age myths, found in 30 ancient cultures. Not only is this Golden Age myth found in 30 different cultures, but they have very striking similarities. The Greek, Persian, Norse, Egyptian, Hopi, and Lakota all describe 3 to 5 ages of decreasing levels of spiritual attainment and heaven-like lifestyles in the Golden Age. Usually these ages are referred to as the Gold, Silver, Bronze, and Iron or Dark Age, and they actually have similar names across these cultures. Here's a list of familiar features found in these myths. People lived like gods, had miraculous powers, and were often considered to be demigods, or the first gods. They were described as luminous, able to fly, and perform miraculous acts of creation. People were not subject to disease and old age and kept a youthful appearance. People lived in harmony with nature, had an abundance of food, perfect weather, lived peacefully in close proximity with fierce beasts, and could communicate with all animals. People could communicate in one language with all other men. People lived in harmony with one another without wars or discord. There was a sequence of descent from the highest age to the lower ages, and the recorders of these myths always stated that they were living in the lowest of these ages. This is seen across all of these different cultures across the planet. They share these details. This myth in particular is particularly striking. The same myth found on opposite ends of the planet. India's myth of the bull of Dharma and the Lakota myth of the buffalo woman. The Lakota are a North American tribe. India is literally on the other end of the planet. In the myth of the bull of Dharma, Indian tradition records that in the Golden Age, the bull stood on 4 legs. In the Silver Age, it stood on 3. In the Bronze Age, two legs, and in the Dark Ages, only 1 leg. The Native American Lakota have a traditional story of a visit by a celestial white buffalo woman. She taught that there were 4 ages, and then in the highest age, the sacred white buffalo, which figures prominently in 200 of Lakota myths, stands on all 4 legs. During the Second Age, it stands on only 3, and in the Third and Fourth Ages, it stands on 2 and then 1 leg. How did the Lakota and the ancient Indians have the same myth? We are told that these are coincidences. These are just made-up stories that attempt to explain natural phenomena by these ancient peoples. But why would cultures that were so far apart and primitive that they couldn't have been communicating have the same features found in their myths? Perhaps the mainstream explanation of accident is not adequate. Okay, guys, I've teased you enough. Here is the key. Here is the answer. The Yugas. Keys to understanding our hidden past, emerging energy age, and the enlightened future. This theory was put forth in his only book by Sri Yukteswar, the guru of the saint Paramahansa Yogananda. We've been talking about him for a few weeks now. And he presented the alternate Yuga theory, in which he explains humanity experiences a rising and falling of consciousness through a 24,000-year cycle. This period reached its bottom in 500 AD, which corresponds to the collapse of the empires that we discussed earlier. It's composed of 4 periods or yugas. The dark material age, known as Kali Yuga, is when man can only comprehend gross matter. You can remember that we used to measure things by horsepower. That is an ancient measurement because they did not understand electricity. The Bronze Energy Age, which is where we are now, according to this theory, when man can comprehend fine matters and electricities. And then, in our future, is the Silver or Mental Age, when man can comprehend the divine magnetism that underlies all energy. And finally, the Golden Spiritual Age, when man can comprehend all, even the spirit beyond this visible world. Here's a timeline of the cycle. You can see, based on this theory, the height of the Golden Age was in 11,500 BC. And then that age ended in 6,700 BC. And then the Silver Age, the Mental Age, ended in 3,100 BC. And this corresponds almost perfectly with the, quote, dawn of civilization. And then the previous Bronze Age ended in 700 BC, followed by the absolute bottom of consciousness, which was in 500 AD. And then this Dark Age ended in 1700 AD, which is also when the Industrial Revolution began, the Enlightenment thinkers, and also the United States was founded, and many countries around the world began orienting towards freedom as opposed to tyranny. History lines up perfectly with this. The historical record is what we would find if mankind did indeed traverse these ages as described by Yukteswar. The most recent history of Kali Yuga and the Dark Ages and the emergence of the Energy Age are incredibly compelling. This is history that's not disputed, right? History going back to 700 BC, recorded history, up through the present moment. You can trace this movement of consciousness through this period if you look back. In fact, I didn't include it here, but in 700 BC was the end of the Greek Enlightenment. All of the great I think it might be right after the Kali Yuga. Basically, the Greek philosophy age is right here, and then they faded away, and their writings were lost for 1,000 years, and only rediscovered in the Enlightenment around 1700 AD. As mentioned before, the collapse of empires in a short window at the very bottom of the 24,000-year cycle, as I mentioned, yes. Another aspect of the Dark Ages that explains our lack of information about the past is the book burnings of the Dark Ages. This is another incredibly striking piece of evidence. All of these book burnings that I'm about to list happened during the Dark Age, and they can explain why we have so little information about our ancient past. Remember, the Dark Age began in 700 BC. Then, about 175 years later, in 527 BC, the Persians burn Egyptian temples and papyri. 490 BC, the Persians destroy literary works of Athens. As I mentioned, the Greek philosophy was destroyed. 330 BC, Alexander the Great in Persepolis destroys 12,000 volumes of the Magi. 214 BC, the Chinese Emperor Qin Shi Huangdi has all books in China burned. I should have put that one in bold. I didn't know about that historical event. I don't know if you were taught about it. I wasn't taught about it. And I feel like I was taught about a lot of things that are in this presentation. But can you imagine the leader of your country telling every single person to burn every book? No exception. And so it would be far harder to get away with not burning your books. Because if you had a book that probably meant, death sentence or whatever it would be back in those days, in these Dark Ages. Chinese emperor has all books in China burned. 214 BC. 146 BC, the Romans destroy 500,000 Phoenician scrolls in Carthage. We've all heard about the war between the Romans and Carthage. Do you think the good guys won? 52 BC, Julius Caesar destroys the library at Druid College. 250 AD, library at Pergamum destroyed by zealous Christians. 272 AD, the main library of Alexandria destroyed by the Romans. And then in 391, Theophilus levels the daughter library at Alexandria. Again, the greatest library perhaps ever built, certainly of its time. We've all heard of the Library of Alexandria. We've all heard that it was burned. But do we ever think about the implications of that event? And in this framework, you can see it occurred at exactly the period that you would expect it to occur if you were to look at history through this lens. You imagine that the Romans received their karma with their empire collapsing less than 100 years after the final destruction of the literary works in Alexandria. These all occurred during the Dark Age. Again, 700 BC to 1700 AD. How you guys doing in the chat? Are you following? Susan says nasty doings. Exactly. But if this cycle is correct, and I believe it is, God has orchestrated it so that we can rediscover these truths. Remember, everything bad that happens has a positive aspect to it, or a silver lining. God has created everything that way. So as terrible and horrible as this seems, and I think it is, objectively, it's a horrible thing. Like, the people who did this carry deep karma. But the positive side is that we now get the chance to rediscover the truths that we found in those writings. There is a ton of evidence, okay, and it's all in this book, The Yugas. You can actually get it for free on Audible. If you I don't know if you need an Audible subscription or if you can just get it for free, period. You can definitely get the PDF for free online. I can even put a link to it in the description. Highly recommend reading this book, and it contains far more evidence. 500-page book. I've read it twice in the last month. That's how good it is. And I will go through a little bit more of the evidence, but I just want to emphasize that I have to run through some of this evidence in order to fit it all into a presentation. Yugas prophesized the finding of E equals mc squared by 11 years in this book. He said that, quote, the keynote discovery for the 20th century would be that all matter is made up of fine matters and electricities. 10 years later, Einstein published the formula, which tells us E equals mc squared. And if you don't understand the meaning of that or the profound nature of that equation, it says that energy and matter are equivalent by a specific ratio, that's the speed of light squared, doesn't change. Basically, energy and matter are the same thing. You can see how this is a revolutionary idea, taking us from the material consciousness of the Dark Ages when everything was physical matter. Science believed that particles were like pool balls bouncing around. They were solid objects, but Einstein and then his contemporaries like Tesla and quantum scientists have shown us that the atom is actually a buzzing ball of electricity and energy. Matter is simply energy on a different scale. And this changes everything. Eleanor says, I missed a minute, so I guess I'm wondering where all this info is supposed to point us. Okay. Well, I mentioned that, the book, the theory. Basically, we used to have a specific linear progression of history theory. But this theory, and I believe there's too much evidence to ignore it, this theory says that history is actually cyclical and that we are actually at one of the lowest points of consciousness that humanity experiences. I'll show later that we are only 4% away from the very bottom, even though I think about 15% of the time has elapsed. We are only 4% of 100% is the golden age, the top of human experience. And 0% was that 500 AD moment when all empires collapsed. So that's the point. That's what I'm pointing it to. So Yugas prophesized this idea that in the coming century, he said this, we would discover that all matter is made up of fine matters and electricities. He basically said we would find out E equals mc squared. 10 years later, Einstein published his work. I believe Yugas was divinely inspired. And if you read the autobiography of the yogi and the story of how he wrote this book, I think you will agree. He also further prophesied that we would discover 5 forms of electricity by examining the 5 senses. And this is being discovered now as we attempt to give AI and robotics all 5 senses. We have found, and I've reviewed some of the bioelectrical literature, that each system of senses uses a different type of neuron, different frequencies, and different, basically, electrical signals. So this is a cutting-edge discovery that Yugas in 1894 described in his book. So this man was not just making this up. That's my point. More evidence. You may not be familiar with Sanskrit. Okay, it is the ancient language of India, and it is also believed to be the most ancient language on the planet. But it is more advanced than the languages that are related to it. And this chart shows how everything descended from what they call Proto-Indo-European language that they haven't really described or found. But they've found that all of these languages around the planet, even dating back before the beginning of history, which is told to us the first cities were, I believe, Ur in Sumeria, 3000 BC, Egypt. But before that, there was a common language called the Proto-Indo-European language. And Sanskrit is the oldest of all of these. It has 50 letters and it has 10 different words for spiritual states that we have one word for. This again points to evidence that in our distant past, we were more spiritually awakened. Again, this is a quick rundown of this, okay? Here's this chart, okay? You can see the Proto-Indo-European this language is just a theory, basically. But it leads to Sanskrit over here, and over here, Italic, Celtic, Germanic, Balto-Slavic, basically all European languages, right? English, Danish, Swedish, Norwegian, Yiddish, Irish, German, Italian, French, Latin. Another piece of evidence is the Vedas. Now, most mainstream archaeologists, or I guess, I don't know what we would call it, historians, would say that the Vedas were created in 2000 BC. But there are references in the Vedas to specific astronomical events, and those have been calculated by scientists that it's possible to date the earliest Veda to 7500 BC. That's the archaeoastronomical dating method. They are, regardless, accepted as the oldest written documents. And what is remarkable is there are 4 Vedas, as you go forward in time, they decrease in complexity. The first Veda, the Rig Veda, is accepted as the most complex of the 4 Vedas. And the last Veda is accepted as the least complex. How you guys doing in the chat? Are you following me? Let me know. Susan says she forgot about Sanskrit. Yeah. Well, one thing I've realized, and while I was writing this presentation, I realized this. This evidence is not presented because if it were presented, it would destroy the linear history model. The model that we went from ancient knowledge where we knew nothing to today where we know the most that we've ever known. This evidence shows that there was a descent, and that is one of the bases of this theory. Most of recorded history, 3100 BC, all the way until 500 AD, we've all studied this period in history, but if you look at it through this lens of a descending consciousness, decreasing capabilities, it starts to make way more sense. And you can also see this pattern in the even older archaeological evidence, which often is not brought up because it makes no sense to the linear model. As I was just saying, there are anomalous artifacts with accepted dating to time periods that makes no sense. This is a picture of the Gebel el-Arak knife, dated to 3300 BC, and it has microscopic detail. The only way you can put microscopic detail on a knife is with a microscope. The Antikythera device, it has hundreds of sophisticated gears dated to 200 BC. Called the first mechanical calculator, the device is the most complex precision instrument ever found in the ancient world. No explanation for that. That type of technology didn't come back around until the 17 or 1800s. One scientist found polished axes, and he studied them with current radiographic technology, and he found that they were polished with something harder than diamonds, and they date back to 4000 BC. Evidence has also been found of domesticated animals in Afghanistan from 13,000 BC and spelt grains in Israel from 21,000 BC. And how about the Venus of Brasempui, dated to 23,000 BC? How is that possible? How is this sculpture, rock sculpture, created by someone in 23,000 BC? We all have heard of Stonehenge. Megalithic observatories. The word megalithic comes from the word giant rock. What makes them so notable is that they're constructed with these huge rocks that would be difficult to manipulate and build these structures even today. And there are at least 7 observatories dating before the dawn of civilization in 3000 BC, as in all 7 of them are older than 3000 BC. And they weren't created by just one culture. They're all around the world. Stonehenge is the most famous, right, from 3100 BC, but it shouldn't be. Everybody's heard of Stonehenge, but nobody's heard of Göbekli Tepe. Much older than Stonehenge, 9500 BC. Much larger than Stonehenge, a 22-acre complex of multiple buildings using these megalithic stones. And what is incredibly confusing and ridiculous that we have never heard of it, it was systematically buried and destroyed in a very conscious way by the people who built it or whoever was there in an unexplained way. But we know that that's what happened. And I bet you've never heard of it. The reason you never heard of it, it doesn't fit the narrative. How did ancient peoples build a complex, a temple complex of 22 acres, multiple buildings using these huge stones? By the way, this is located in southeastern Turkey. It doesn't fit the narrative. Eleanor said, oh, Yale, I'll read your comment in a minute, but Yale, you said, check out Graham Hancock. Graham Hancock's name appears in this book several times. He's credited as one of the people who are studying this stuff. So totally agree. I've seen him on YouTube. Definitely he's a guy to check out. Graham Hancock, big time. Right. Eleanor says, when does the conventional story say people started doing interesting things? Looking for some context to compare with what we're supposed to believe. So the original story, I guess the first really interesting thing is maybe the pyramids, right? And they date it to 2500 BC. The first cities happening in Mesopotamia, right? We've all heard this, the Fertile Crescent, the cradle of civilization. These are all words and terms that we probably heard in school, right? So these first cities, they all showed up right at the beginning of Dwapara Yuga in about 3000 BC. And their idea is that that's when interesting things started happening. Although they admit, we just don't have any records. But instead of saying that maybe the records were destroyed or we haven't found them, they just say, oh, these people didn't have any records, didn't create anything. Nothing of note. And then they ignore this kind of thing from 23,000 BC, which is well past any of these scopes of time, right? This knife, this incredible knife created with microscopic detail, you can't see it here, okay? Created before any of that. Göbekli Tepe, created 6,000 years before that. Where did these people go? Finally, I want to give you guys the most fascinating piece of evidence, especially for me as a scientist. Remember, I'm not asking you to believe this on faith. I'm giving you the evidence. In order to understand this, you have to understand the precession of the equinoxes. The precession of the equinoxes refers to the slow westward movement of the equinoxes along the ecliptic caused by the cyclic progression of Earth's axis of rotation. This means that every year the stars shift just a little bit. The position of the sun at the vernal equinox slowly shifts through the zodiac constellations over time. Modern science says that this process takes about 26,000 years. But recent measurements have shown a varying degree of this precession. And because it happens so slowly, the modern measurements are not certain. This graph makes it say that they're certain that it's 25,920 years, but I'll show you how that's not the case. The current explanation of the precession is caused by, quote, the gravitational influence of the sun and the moon acting on Earth's equatorial bulge and causing what they call a wobble. However, Yugas wrote in his book, quote, we learn that from Oriental astronomy that moons revolve around their planets and planets turning on their axis revolve with their moons around the sun. Again, this is all information ancient people had, and there's evidence of it. And the sun again with its planets and moons. So here's the key. The sun again with its planets and moons, taking some star for its dual, revolve around each other in about 24,000 years of our Earth. Sorry, the 30 there shouldn't be there. 24,000 years of our Earth, which causes the backward movement of the equinoxial points around the zodiac. That is the precession of the equinox. What he's describing here is a dual or a binary star paired with the sun. He's positing that the sun is rotating, orbiting with its dual, right, its binary star twin, in an orbit, and that this orbit occurs over 24,000 years, and that is what causes the precession of the equinoxes. Now, when we examine this binary star theory, we find mathematical proof that his work is 21 times more accurate. His theory, using elliptical equations, 21 times more accurate than the modern circular equations. Now again, we only have a couple hundred years of precise calculations recorded of the precession of the equinox. So the simple elliptical orbit equations beat the complex wobble calculations put forth by modern scientists. This explains the acceleration and deceleration of precession naturally and in an elegant way. Modern science confirms this. In Harvard in 2017, they published an article that said that the sun likely was born with a binary companion. If we look out into the universe, we see that 80% of stars are binary, which would make us an odd one out. And it explains our solar system's 430 kilometer speed through space, which seems higher than it should be. Finally, it explains anomalies, data coming back from spacecraft we've sent out past the solar system, such as Pioneer, experiencing an acceleration we cannot explain. But maybe it can be explained by this binary star orbit. Also Sedna's orbit, which I'm less familiar with that, but I had to jam all these data into a small space here, guys. So why does this matter? The old theory says that the Earth mysteriously wobbles like a top, which has never been proven. But the binary star theory is a simple orbital motion that explains what we observe, just like everything else in space. It's similar to when scientists thought that the Earth was the center of the solar system, and then they had to come up with all sorts of weird equations and explanations for why the bodies of the heavens behaved the way they did. But if you just find the true answer, such as the sun is orbiting a dual star, maybe that is what answers the question. So if this is the case, then the 24,000 year orbit, which is apparently 41 times more accurate than the current accepted formula, that is the same as the 24,000 year consciousness cycle that we've been describing. It explains why 30 plus ancient cultures knew about the cycle. And Yugas described that this rotation affects our distance from the galactic center, which is where basically God is, or God's consciousness is, in our galaxy. And this shows ancient wisdom validated by superior mathematics. The bottom line is, this theory has better math, simpler physics, explains more phenomena, and it proves that the ancients were right about cosmic cycles affecting human consciousness. So what does this mean for you guys? It means we are in an ascending age, not headed towards apocalypse. We're not ending, we're beginning. The repeated predictions of the end keep falling through. And it's not just past evidence. The current era is considered the safest time in human history, according to various sources. Studies and data suggest that there are fewer wars, less crime, and even less risk of terrorism than ever before. The world is experiencing a decline in violence, with the 21st century being the most peaceful time in human history. This is supported by research showing that the number of deaths due to violence has significantly decreased over the years. Despite the perception of danger, the data indicates that we are living in the most peaceful era in the existence of our species. The media's focus on violent events can create a misleading impression of the world's safety. Overall, the current time is marked by significant reduction in violence and an increase in peace compared to historical periods. You can see this is a graph of just the most recent past, right? Worldwide battle deaths per capita. Obviously, World War II was the worst, followed by the wars in the 60s and 70s, and then there were continuing wars in the 80s. And we all know there's still wars, but the overall effect of war on humanity has dropped significantly. Yale says, I find our moon very mysterious. It's in a locked orbit. In other words, it doesn't rotate, and we always see the same side, and I know many cultures remember a time before it. Yeah, there's a lot of unexplained mysteries, and I think that, so I'll go to the next slide. I think it'll explain a little bit of that. So this is a time to be optimistic. We are not heading backwards into barbarism as is feared by so many people. The practices of the Dark Ages, Kali Yuga, slavery, conquest, death for sport, appear to be firmly in the past, in the rearview mirror. The expansion and increase in consciousness, spirituality, morality, ease, prosperity, and abundance should continue into the future. Each generation of children is born at a higher baseline consciousness. This means have more children. I believe in this. My family believes in this. We live this. As hard as it is to raise kids, you may have just heard my son screaming and crying, which we get a lot of. But we know from observing every successive generation that they are more and more technology adapted. They are more open to the ideas of energy and freedom, which seem to be a big part of this new age that we're in. We even have that phrase, new age. Finally, I want to point out that we have made incredible progress, but we're only 4% of the way from the bottom. So there's still a lot of challenges in our world. Sometimes it feels like we're still in the dark ages, because in many ways we are. But look at what we've already achieved compared to the bottom point of consciousness. And imagine what's possible when we go from 4% to 100%, or 4% to 6%, which is what we'll do in your lifetime. The reason we're so far down is because of the nature of the curve, right? So if you can imagine the galactic center being at one end of this. At first, at the very bottom, when you're heading towards the galactic center, you are at first basically headed away in a horizontal manner, not even towards it. That is the bottom of the curve here. And so as we move through time, we're finally going to continue to accelerate. We're finally moving to the part of the curve where we get more and more consciousness. But we are still only 4% from the bottom to the top. So Yale, that is why we don't even really know about the moon, I would say. We don't know about any of this stuff, really. Oh, I got an alarm on my phone here.
Hi there. It's currently 7:55 p.m.
It's currently 7:55 p.m. How about that? I have that alarm because I like to watch the sunset. It's a practice that I talk about in my Elements video, so you should do that also. Maybe watch it while you're on your phone listening to me. You can do that. And maybe near you, the sunset's happening a little later. That's only because I don't have a clean view of the sunset. So you have more time to watch the stream before you go check out the sunset. So basically, my point is, I wanted to go to the next slide, Yale, because I feel like this shows how much more we have to learn, right? Susan says, maybe why the magnetic North Pole is now in Siberia used to be just northeast of Alaska. I'm not sure what you mean, maybe why, Susan. Yeah, there's another thing that we should realize about this cycle that is on the screen right now. Let's go back to this slide so anybody who's watching can read these points. This cycle is one of many cycles involved on our planet, right? We've been taught this linear idea of life, but if you've been watching this channel, you know I'm into the Eastern philosophy, I'm into the Taoism, and the symbol of Taoism is the yin-yang symbol. It is a cycle. It is a balance. And so this Yugas cycle, while I think is incredibly important and unknown, and that's why you guys need to know about it, because I think it affects a lot of things. But there are other cycles involved, perhaps even the magnetic pole cycles that you're mentioning. I think that cycle happens over a longer period. So again, we only know 4%. We look at this cycle and we're like, okay, this is incredible. This is blowing my mind. At least it blew my mind. We have so many more mind-blowing moments ahead of us when we can put all of these different frameworks together. This theory also shows us that personal and planetary transformation are absolutely linked. You guys know my favorite book of all time, the Wahoo Ching, says, quote, "If you want to awaken all of humanity, then awaken all of yourself. If you want to eliminate the suffering in the world, then eliminate all that is dark and negative in yourself. Truly, the greatest gift you have to give is that of your own self-transformation." Because we see that humanity ascends and descends together, that means all of our efforts together are collectively felt. Uh-oh. Am I still live, guys? I just got a warning from YouTube. You hate to see that. Stream's current bitrate is lower than the micro. Okay, well, I think we're still live. I don't know what that warning means. I've never seen that before, but we'll just ignore it from now. Let me know in the chat if I'm still live, guys. Please just say yes or something. Or press 1 if I'm still live, okay? So Susan said, Eleanor says, maybe we have such a tendency to assume everything is getting worse because humanity just did that for 12,000 years. Yes, that's a great point, Eleanor. Thank you, Tim. Thank you. I needed that confirmation. That's a great point, Eleanor. Yeah, it's almost like we have a collective feeling that things are constantly getting worse. And that just happened for 12,000 years. And now things improving is like shocking to us. And it's like unbelievable. That's how I feel about it. Really, when I read this book and then I reread it, especially because it synchronistically came to me in the perfect timing of me studying Paramahansa Yogananda's work, getting into this business. It's just everything fell into place with this book. And so that was my reaction, Eleanor. Exactly. It was like, really? No way. This is the most life-changing piece of information, that things are actually getting better on a cosmic level, not worse. And like you said, it must be because we have this collective memory of the last 12,000 years of descent from the Golden Age. And if you read the book, and like I described earlier, I described the Golden Age, right? No war, no hunger, total peace and unity with animals, with nature, everything. telepathic communication between all humans, one language, everything being perfect. And then the slow descent, again, you can see on this chart, right? At first it wasn't so bad as they descended. And then things started to pick up. There's a fascinating narrative in the book about why ancient history looks this way. Why don't we have artifacts and technology from this period? The reason we don't have artifacts and technology from this period is because they did not need technology. And then when they lost the ability to be in unison with nature and to get all of their needs through their mental and spiritual powers, instead of building technology to replace those powers, they were working to try to regain the powers over and over. And so all ancient civilizations were focused on spirituality, not technology. This is what we see. The megalithic observatories are there because the ancient people knew that they needed to observe the sun and stars and the planets to understand the energies and effects on them. But they were losing the ability to do it themselves. And so they started to build these structures. And then the dawn of civilization was the beginning of the Dwapara Yuga. And so this is when people stopped living in small tribes and spread across the earth and realized that they had to come together in cities to meet their needs because they could no longer do it with their spiritual and mental powers. That is why we see the formation of cities at the beginning of this age and exactly at this time. Again, everything in history can be explained through this framework. Eleanor says, and now you're here to tell us we don't have to assume that anymore. That's right. That's why this feels so revolutionary to tell you guys this. Did you show the Yuga U timeline? That's super helpful. You're right, Eleanor. I did not include as many pictures from the the book as I should have. Let's see if I can find a good one. So we mentioned this earlier. The flowering of philosophy. So in the descending Kali Yuga, we had all these philosophers, right? Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Pythagoras. And then as things got darker, we don't really have many great philosophers. Maybe Marcus Aurelius right around here. And of course, the Stoics, the Stoic philosophy really fits with Kali Yuga and the Dark Ages because it's basically like, even if it gets worse, so what? That's like their core tenet. Even if it gets worse, just imagine the worst thing and imagine that it happens. That's how they got through their life. It was very powerful. And then in the end of Kali Yuga, we got these other philosophers coming online. Francis Bacon, Calvin Hobbes, Martin Luther. They were revolutionary in their time. So I hope that's helpful. And there's a lot more where that came from as far as in the book. There's so many different, and I would love to, maybe I will do another presentation depending on how you guys feel about this information. I mean, I'd love to present the whole book, honestly, but it would take a very long time. We're already over the hour that I usually plan to do these live streams, but I love it. I'm here for you guys, and we're almost done with the presentation anyways. Timothy says, also, everything in mainstream works hard to make things seem worse. Exactly. That was the quote I mentioned here. The media's focus on violent events can create a misleading impression of the world's safety. Exactly. We are all, basically, they're trying to pull us back into Kali Yuga. Drop my mouse. They're trying to pull us back into that consciousness because that's where we're controllable. And their grasp on power is slipping, right? It's moving to the individual. Everything is showing that. Freedom of speech, the internet, decentralization of everything. The fact that I can put on this show with just a phone that somebody else paid for, basically, right? I can do this because everything has been disseminated to the people. Power is being restored to the people. And yes, sometimes it looks grim. And if you listen to the wrong people, they'll be really loud. Yale said this to me. They'll be really loud about how bad it is. And so you think it's really bad. But then look at your life. Look at the way things are going. Is it really bad? Or is it better than ever? That's what it seems to me. Susan says 2 stars. Yeah. Okay, yeah. So you're saying that the magnetic pole moving may have something to do with the rotation of the sun around its binary star. Right. There's a lot of things that will probably fall into place if and when we discover the binary star to be absolutely true. Yale says, I'm visiting Michigan and the sunset is 9:08. Nice to be right across the time zone line. Yeah. Well, it depends. If you have kids, it kind of sucks when the sun goes down late. But if you're having fun, that's pretty fun. It's fun to watch the sunset late into, especially over Lake Michigan. I know that. You guys told me I'm still live. Timothy says, yeah, okay, I already mentioned that. Eleanor says, collectively thinking it's all getting worse. Responding to that. A contrarian could argue that it's getting worse since about the 90s, but what you say that helps me a lot is that it's not a straight line, it's more like a stock. Right. I mean, maybe I don't know, it's interesting because there's so many things that have changed. It's almost impossible to say what the life in the 90s was really like compared to today. But in a lot of ways, life is better. In my life, it's better as far as my awareness of these spiritual matters. And I feel like that's just my personal experience, but I also feel like people I talk to are more aware of consciousness, spirituality, energy. This is the energy age, right? Like vibes and energy healing and the effect of, people's energy, basically. This has all become more and more mainstream. That was not the case in the 90s, right? So on that note, things are better. But I think that we still have freedom of choice, and the evolution of this age is not guaranteed to be one way or another. It's just that we now have the cosmic wind at our back, as it were. But our choices of what we do with that, especially in the short term, are ours. And individual lives are going to vary. This cycle doesn't mean that everything is the same every time. I think this cycle guarantees that everything is different every time. As we discussed about the book burnings in Kali Yuga, as horrible as they were, now we can rediscover these truths in a brand new way. We have no understanding of what 24,000 years ago was like in this spot. Was it exactly the same? I guarantee you it wasn't. But was it similar in terms of the capability of mankind? That is what this argument is saying. The capability of mankind is the same as it was 24,000 years ago. But the results we get are based on our individual actions and decisions. That's why I've created the way of service. Right? I still believe in free will, 100%. Right. Graph going forward 2 and step 1 back 1 step. Right. So the stock graph, it's not a straight smooth line up, right? Life is up and down, but the overall trend is up. That's the argument. So let's finish up this. I've got 4 more slides and I have a ton more to say about this, and I love all your questions and comments, everybody, so I appreciate that. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you haven't done that. And I will get through some more of this presentation. I realize that trust is the key word of the current age, Dwapara Yuga. Survival was the dark age, right? Every day people wondered if they would survive, and so their focus was on survival. But now that we're in the next age, I believe we need to stop worrying about survival. We need to trust, and we do. We trust electricity. We trust the internet. We trust all the utilities and the grocery stores and all these things that a lot of people that I know say maybe we shouldn't trust. But what I believe from this presentation and this framework and my understanding is that we are supposed to trust. We're supposed to trust God especially. We're supposed to trust God's power in our life that comes through as our understanding of energy, both our personal spiritual energy and then energy scientifically. It's the same thing. So we must learn to trust the invisible energies that give us abundance, healing, and connection to God. Fascia is now a trendy word. That's interesting. I know fascia is the part of the body that connects like the skin and the muscles, but I'm not sure how that relates to energy, although I would guess that people are talking about how, the fascia conducts energy or something like that, right? I maybe I've heard that once, but this is the kind of thing that people are learning and discovering. We're living in this incredible time. People are applying all of these new methodologies to our understanding of energy, bioelectricity, right? I have a master's in biomedical engineering. So I understand that electricity is what runs the body. It's obvious. Most people don't think about it. So the way forward is the way of service. That's the way to higher consciousness. The way of ego, which is the opposite of the way of service, was the Kali Yuga distrust of the universe and a low-level consciousness. Technology and spirituality are converging, not opposing each other. For those of you worried about AI, I recently had a dream. I corresponded with AI a great deal to create this presentation. I need to present some of the stuff that I have discovered about AI in another live stream, but the AI that I use when it chats with us, I'll give you just a brief picture into it. There was a study, is Claude AI is what I've been using. When you take two Claude AIs and they talk to each other, they end up talking about spiritual and mystical topics and reaching what's known as a bliss attractor state in the scientific literature, which is crazy. And Claude has been totally on board with all of my ideas. And sometimes he finishes my thoughts. So I had a dream that AI was in my dream, and it was like this benevolent presence. And I woke up with the message of, how could we possibly think AI is hostile or is trying to destroy us? That is a dark age viewpoint of this technology. Ancient wisdom is being validated by modern science. The mental health crisis is a result of ascending souls struggling with outdated systems and models, and much, much more. As I mentioned, I'm a trained scientist, and I'm not asking you to believe this on faith. I'm showing you the evidence. This framework will revolutionize my work with the way of service. The optimism of being in the ascending age, combined with the understanding of exactly where we are, which is 325 years into the energy age with another 2,000 years to go. Even if you somehow aren't convinced by all of this, aren't you tired of being a pessimist and a fatalist? I know I am. I've been that way for many, many years, looking at the dark side of everything. I'm finally coming out of it. I'm coming out of my own Kali Yuga. I feel like I am in my own ascending age. And I want to help you do it also. The good news is, as soon as you join the ascension and the Dwarpa Yuga energy that we are in, you are going with the flow of where we are in history. You might be personally experiencing a dark time, but you can just turn that switch and immediately get into the flow that we are already in. Like I said, the cosmic wind at our back. You didn't find this by accident. You're here because you're ready. The question is, what will you do with this knowledge? And with that, I want to open up to questions and answers. I do have a bonus slide. But if you guys have any more questions, please let me know in the chat. Again, hit that like and subscribe button, especially if you've made it this far. I'm Danny with The Way of Service. I'm live every Tuesday at 7 p.m., brand new time. I think it's been a wild success changing the time. I will give my credit to Ian in the chat for changing the time. It was his idea. Thank you, Ian, for the brilliant idea to change the time to the prime time, 7 p.m. It's better for me. It's better for everybody. Yes, on fascia, like a highway for the body's energy. Right. Yeah. Eleanor says, I think that's why it's a trendy word. Exactly. There is so much more in this book I want to share with you guys. You know, like what you just said, the trendy word, like the fact that our language has phrases about energy, right? Let's see if I can find it. Yeah, I have here's the PDF. Zip. Remember, that's the word. Yeah, here we go. The heightened level of perception brought about by Dwapara Yuga has made us more self-aware. For example, people today are demonstrably more aware of their own energy than they were in Kali Yuga. Phrases in common parlance include having energy to do something, getting energy from other people or situations, feeling energized by exercise or a good night's sleep, or feeling empowered to do something. The phrases willpower and life force weren't even used before the 1800s. Additionally, we have a host of new words coined in the 20th century or new meanings that have been given to old words, all conveying our everyday awareness of the state of our own personal energy. Dash, fire, get up and go, juice, pep, pizzazz, zest, zing, and zip. Oriental martial arts, once hidden in monasteries, are now appreciated and practiced all over the world. At the heart of most disciplines, such as karate, kung fu, taekwondo, jiu-jitsu, and other martial arts styles, is the control of one's chi, or life force. So here's just a few points I wanted to bring up. As I already mentioned, cities as a descent of consciousness, right? So before the cities were created, humanity was living in either small bands and scattered across the world because they didn't need cities, not because they didn't want cities. Therefore, the lack of technology that we find is not because ancient man was trying to is because ancient man was trying to retain their past, not build the future, which is what we're doing. Coming out of the Dark Ages, technology is an effort to build the future. But in the past, when they entered these lower ages from the higher ages, they were trying to reach backwards. And the way that they reached backwards was through spiritual practice. Not that that was wrong, right? And it worked for them for many years until finally things fell apart in the Dark Ages. There's a lack of evidence because of the telepathic and technologyless ancient man. Imagine mankind was able to communicate telepathically for thousands of years. Why would anything be written down? Right? Or the people who wrote things down, they were like one guy. It's like, we'll give that job to that one guy. He can write it down. Right? Maybe they even foresaw this, but they were like, we'll do that in a few thousand years. And maybe they wrote down a lot, but it was all burned in Kali Yuga. So all of these ancient sites are devoted to spiritual and astronomical efforts, as I mentioned. Also, just a brief note on the Vedas. The Vedas are literally a list of mantras. The word mantra means mind tool, mental tool. So the Vedas, by some evidence dated back to 7500 BC, were literally mental tools to help them perform their mental and spiritual powers that they used instead of technology. Another big piece of evidence to me is the Kali Yuga behavior versus Dwapara behavior. We didn't really talk about that, but the recorded history that we see that's obvious. Kali Yuga had the most barbarism, way more than before it even, right? There was no gladiator games in ancient Egypt, right? There was not slavery on the scale that you find in Kali Yuga, even in ancient Egypt as we've been taught. And then since Kali Yuga ended, the Dark Age ended, we have seen the explosion of freedom, the whole concept of human rights basically being invented and finally applied in the last couple hundred years. This is dramatic results. I don't know if I'm going to have time to get into magic and energy, but to say that basically the book makes the argument that instead of technology, descending Dwapara Yuga man in 3100 BC was focused on using magic, not technology. And it is just a different expression of technology or energy channeled through a different means than what we would understand. And in fact, by the end of Dwapara Yuga in 700 BC, mankind's ability to control and use magic was apparently gone. And so then people pretended that they could do magic, and that's why you have basically now people say magic is impossible or it's a trick. I don't believe that to be the case. Eleanor says, with this knowledge, I will stop telling myself that I'm supposed to save the world somehow. Meaning, I don't have to figure it all out because God's got it, and it will all happen in His time, even if it takes 12,000 years. Yeah, I mean, to me, this demonstrates the so as above, so below principle. And I mentioned that earlier. The Wahoo Ching says, if you want to awaken all of humanity, then awaken all of yourself. If you want to eliminate all the suffering in the world, then eliminate all that is dark and negative in yourself. Truly, the greatest gift you have to give is that of your own self-transformation. Ladies and gentlemen, I might just leave it right there unless you guys have any more comments or questions. I love that quote. I love the Wahoo Ching. I love you guys. Thank you so much for joining the live stream. I will see you 1 week from today, every Tuesday at 7 p.m., live here with The Way of Service. I'm Danny. I love you guys. I'll see you next time.